Welcome, everyone. My guest today is reporter Brooklee Han to talk about 4 title companies that settled kickback charges, more problems with real estate forms, and the companies looking to replace agents with AI. Brooklee, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. As always, there is so much going on. And today we're going to start with title. You have a very busy beat on the real estate side, but you also cover title for us. And we have a story that you published today that has been brewing for a while. So let's talk about what happened with this settlement with 4 title agencies.
Yeah, so it has been a hot sec since I've had to dive in on the title insurance side of things. So maybe not the best news for title insurance companies, but I'm excited to be back covering title a little bit more deeply with this story. But there are 4 title insurance firms in the Washington, D.C. area: Allied Title and Escrow, KVS Title, Modern Settlements, and Union Settlements, who all agreed to settle civil claims with the Washington, D.C. Attorney General's office. And the claims were that these 4 title insurance companies engaged in a kickback scheme because the real estate agents and brokerages who were part of joint ventures or affiliated businesses that these title insurance companies were getting dividends or getting profits or shares of profits from these companies that they invested in. And the DC Attorney General's office felt that those payments were in return or due to referrals and payments for referrals, which is not allowed under RESPA under any state regulations. But what makes this one really interesting is that it was not a RESPA violation that was brought. It was a specific DC code violation. And that's because the DC code is a little bit more stringent than your RESPA laws. And under RESPA, there are kind of carve-outs for joint ventures. Joint ventures and affiliated businesses, if they're set up properly, are completely legal and have been around for a while and are very much allowed. But with the way this DC law was interpreted, the Attorney General's office felt that those profits that the real estate agents or brokerages were receiving in return for their investments in these affiliated businesses or joint ventures, was in violation. And so basically, makes it feel like affiliated businesses and joint ventures with title companies or between real estate and title is probably not going to be okay in the DC area moving forward.
I think this was the most surprising thing when I read the story was that you think, oh, okay, this kickbacks or, referral services must be RESPA. So I think it has to just be terrible if you're a title agency. You're like, I'm good. I'm following the RESPA laws. I'm good. And then it's a DC local law that trips you up.
Yes. Yeah. And I think these title insurance companies are frustrated. I spoke with some of the attorneys that represent these companies today. And they are frustrated by this, especially because the Department of Insurance approved these title insurance companies, and they approved them knowing that some of the investors were business referral sources. They said that was fine. And then, the Attorney General's office turns around. I mean, some of these companies have been operational for a while and they come around and say that, no, this is not okay. And it's also frustrating because the code that they used prevents it for rebates or fee splitting. And it's from a payment or a rebate from the insurer, which is the title insurance company, to the insured, which in this instance is not the real estate brokerage or, a real estate agent. It would be the property owner or the lender or the bank, and whoever the title insurance policy was protecting. So I think it was, they're frustrated that this law was interpreted this way. Because it was definitely not something that they were expecting to have to contend with.
Well, and I think one of the points that you quote a lawyer, right, for the title insurance companies, and he talks about how what this means in the end. Like if they don't have those affiliated businesses, it's not necessarily better for the consumer.
Absolutely. So a lot of these title insurance companies are joint ventures or are affiliated businesses. And, that cuts options for consumers if they're no longer allowed to operate in the DC area. So that instead of increasing competition, that decreases competition. And a lot of times, at least according to these attorneys, the fees that the affiliated businesses or joint ventures were charging consumers were less than some of the kind of independent companies out there. They all also obviously had to have disclosures, as you have to do with RESPA. And all of these companies had disclosures and were providing those to consumers, about what their ownership was, and also encourage them to look elsewhere for their title insurance needs. And most of a lot of the consumers ended up coming back to the joint venture or the affiliated business because they were able to get a better fee. But at the same time, the attorney that I spoke with for Allied Title said that, less than half of the business came from referrals from these investors in the company.
So, how did they settle? What did they have to pay?
So the four companies in total paid 3.3 million. Allied ended up paying the most at 1.9 million. KVS paid 1 million. Modern Settlements paid 325,000, and Union Settlements paid 65,000. And part of the reason why Allied paid a little bit more was there were videos and photos of the real estate agents who were investors in the title insurance company at a yacht party. According to the attorney I spoke with, it was not a reward for sending business. This was like an investor occasion. I know in the past as well, there have been instances where an LO who was friends with the title agent or, the executive at a title firm. He had, a cabin in Aspen. They were personal friends. They went there and got to stay and go skiing over the weekend kind of situation and posted online and said, thank you to, this title exec for letting us borrow your cabin. And it was a family friend situation, not a kickback situation. But of course, it was interpreted as a kickback situation that LO had ended up having to pay a massive fine. So, it very well could be one of those situations with this yacht party. And, if the attorney says so, it very well could be. But yeah, you just have to be so careful, even if you're, it is a family friend situation, and, be careful what you post online.
That's really true. Also, I mean, one of the attorneys noted that it really depends on how they are defining kickback, right? How
Mm-hmm,
they're defining a thing of value.
mm-hmm,
And he took issue with that, with an investment being the same thing as that. It's a little bit complicated the way I'm explaining it. You do a great job explaining it and letting him explain it in the story. But
yes.
again, it just speaks to the fact that these are complex rules and regulations to figure out and make sure that you're, compliant with, especially if you feel like, you went and did the extra thing and, the insurance said yes. And, it's just like, how do
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah, it is. It's very challenging. But the one thing that I will say is this has been brewing for quite a while. I think it really started about 2 years ago. There was some chatter, especially in the DC area, which is interesting that this is kind of the first big one to pop up, where people were disgruntled by these JVs and these affiliated businesses. People in the title insurance world, some of them were saying that these were illegal, that, the investments constituted kickbacks. And I know there's also been interest in other states as well. On the East Coast, kind of surrounding DC, Maryland's definitely one of them, but I know there's been some action as well out in Arizona. So, if you're a real estate agent or a broker or a title company that is a joint venture or an affiliated business, this is definitely something to keep an eye on because it's potential to get messy moving forward.
Yeah, and we know, I mean, it's not like real estate agents over the last 2 years have made a ton of money. So that,
Yeah.
a joint venture with a title company was a great idea, is a great idea in many
Mhm.
ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of folks kind of in light of concerns about what might happen with commissions with the NAR settlement business practice changes. A lot of those folks have thought about kind of diversifying their business model. And if they don't have a joint venture set up, maybe doing some of that or having an affiliated business because it's a great way to bring in a little bit of extra income and kind of help that bottom line that might be hurting from a drop in commission revenue.
Well, that's a good segue into, some of the other stories I wanted to ask you about, which is back to the NAR settlement. We cannot escape it. And the fact that there's a new report out by an academic who looked at the forms, 19, I think 19 forms or forms from 19 states or
Mhm.
areas, and still sees a lot of problems with it. So give us a little backstory on who this person is and why she's looking at forms.
Sure. So the report was written and prepared by Tanya Monastir, who is a contracts law professor at the University of Buffalo. Her name might sound familiar because previously and earlier this summer, she worked with the Consumer Federation of America on on a report about the new buyer agency agreement and listing agreement that was put out by the California Association of Realtors, which sounds like it might have been part of the source of the DOJ's interest in the CAR forms that were supposed to go out earlier this summer and then were delayed before going out again. But this latest report is not affiliated with the CFA. And as you said, she looked at forms from 19 different state and local realtor associations, or she singled out forms from those state and local realtor associations. She did not specifically call out any of the forms that may have been promulgated by any brokerages. So it is unclear if she kind of analyzed those as well or what she did. But there were 3 states that she was kind of okay with their forms. Those were Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Utah. But all of the other states or local association forms that she analyzed, she found that they were incomprehensible or contained terms that were, confusing to home buyers, or contained terms that kind of look to avoid the terms of the NAR settlement. And basically at the end of the day, you want to make sure your forms are easily understandable and that they don't contain terms that, I think a lot of folks who really have been on top of this know that they, shouldn't have things like, kind of open-ended commissions on buyer agreements saying that, the commission will be whatever the seller is offering. As
Right.
in this new world, what happens if your home buyer is like, I really want this house, the seller isn't offering any form of compensation, and you have an agreement that says, you're going to take whatever the seller is offering. Well, sorry for you, the seller is offering nothing. So that's problematic. But also, the NAR settlement specifically says it has to be a specific percentage or dollar amount that you will be compensated as the buyer broker. So that's one of the things. Some of them apparently also were containing things for allowing for bonuses, or allowing for the buyer's agent to, keep whatever the seller was offering, even if it was over what they had previously agreed upon with the buyer. Also, there were apparently some allowed for a lot of modifications. Obviously, modifications can be made, and that is allowed, but ones to, up the amount of compensation because, maybe you had agreed on 2.5% and the seller was in a slower market and the seller really is motivated and the seller is willing to offer 3%, motivating or modifying the form to do something like that, not okay. So, just things like that, things that I know there's been a lot of education on from realtor associations, these smart business practice changes that should be in place. And, a lot of people are following and, still being successful and able to transact and do business. But just making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. So I found it really interesting that, a lot of these forms contained some of these items. But I also know that a lot of realtor associations are going back through their forms and editing and sending out new ones. The business practice changes as of today, when we're speaking on Thursday, have been in place nationwide for 12 days. And I know
Right.
some of, already started making changes last week, less than a week out. So it's definitely a learning experience for everyone as they kind of figure out what's okay and what's not okay. But yeah, I feel like some of these mistakes probably could have been avoided.
It's really unfortunate because I don't feel like anybody was given enough time for these forms. When you
Mm,
think about the complexity, and also just, I mean, we've talked before about how it reminds us of like what happened with TRID, right?
mhm.
On the mortgage side, it's like, oh, we changed they changed a lot of things. It wasn't just forms, but there were forms involved and disclosure statements and when you had to send them and all of those things. And they were given much more time than this.
Yeah.
And so I hope on the back end that the Department of Justice and other people, consider that when if they're looking to take action. It's like, you didn't give them a lot of time,
Mhm.
and and they're changing it as fast as they can. But I think in this litigious environment, I mean, we know what's going to happen. So are you going to be sued by a buyer? Are you going to be sued by a seller? Are you going to is the DOJ going to take exception with it? I mean, it's pretty fraught.
Yeah, absolutely. And, now potentially is your state regulator of some description going to take issue with the JV or title affiliated business you have. So it's definitely a stressful time in the industry. And a lot of folks, are concerned about some of these actions that may come out. But I think if you're being proactive, if you're smart about the forms you're using, and I know that's why a lot of brokers decided to create their own forms because one, either their state was waiting up until, the last minute to send out forms, or they didn't necessarily agree or felt like the forms that were being promulgated by their state or local association aligned with the terms of the NAR settlement. So, I know that was costly and not all brokerages could do something like that, but, I think it was a necessary step.
Yes. So I was at the NAMBA conference last week, and our CEO Clayton Collins interviewed Leo Pareja
Mhm.
of EXP, and he famously did that, right? He was proactive and came out with that because he still had states that hadn't come out with anything, and he was not leaving it to chance. So I think that's really smart, being proactive, because in this environment, I don't think you can be too careful.
No, I don't think you can either. And it's definitely, you want to take your time going through things, especially right now as everyone's adjusting to these new forms. It's not second nature, to deal with some of the changes that have been in place. And, I think consumers also are aware that there's a lot going on. So they are probably either going to come with questions that they have about, the things they've read in the news or seen on the TV. Or they're also just going to be more understanding of the fact that like you're going to have to walk them through all of this a little bit more closely than you may have in, past transactions. If they're a repeat home buyer or seller.
Okay, well, let's add one more thing into the mix for real estate agents. And that is, you wrote a story about some firms that are looking to really leverage AI in a different way, really to almost replace the agents. Now, some of these firms are very new, but let's talk about this and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, so obviously, all of these business practice changes, everything that's going on is not happening in a vacuum. And typically, when I talk about that, we're talking about kind of macroeconomic factors. But there's also a lot of technological advancement that's happening right now as well. And a lot of that has obviously been around AI. And so we've seen a bunch of firms kind of pop up, especially in the past couple of months, some as recent as like a week or two ago, looking to help home buyers specifically in their transaction who maybe want to go unrepresented or maybe want to kind of do things a little bit more on their own than they would with a traditional real estate agent. And these companies are leveraging AI to help consumers or home buyers, answer all of their nagging questions about the home buying process, kind of guide them through every step of the way, and also do that while not, bogging down a real estate agent. Some of these firms are the buyers who utilize these services. I spoke with ReAlpha, Modern Realty, and Homa, and buyers who utilize ReAlpha and Modern Realty are considered represented buyers and do have to sign a buyer representation agreement with either of the two firms that they choose. But they do have a human real estate agent available if they, really, really need that human interaction or have a question that they are, they want to go to a experienced professional with. But they have the AI accessible 24/7 to answer all of the questions that they may have and to help guide them through the process. Homa is a little different. It was the newest one that I had spoken with. They launched earlier this month. And it's right now it's free to users. And buyers are not represented, but it will help. It's a platform basically that answers all the questions. It's kind of like a guide, an educational tool that buyers can use to kind of walk them through the process, answer any questions that they have. And at least in Florida, they're trying to expand it nationwide. But you also have tools that will kind of help you fill out the forms if you're looking to submit an offer on a property, and explains what goes in each blank basically, because a consumer might not instinctively know that unless they have previously purchased properties. But that product is available nationwide. Just that specific form component isn't quite there yet. But I think that's a really helpful tool for home buyers that want to be unrepresented. If you choose to go that path. So I obviously, this is a very emotional experience buying a house. And AI is not going to provide you with that same experience. But if you're an experienced home buyer and you want to potentially give something like this a try, I think, if that's the path you choose, that's definitely an option. And I think there is a space for tools to help home buyers who do want to kind of go this route. And with the advancement of this technology, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think this will be an overnight change. There's definitely going to be a lot more development in AI moving forward. And I think we're all kind of waiting to see exactly how consumers respond to these business practice changes and the kind of a new environment we're in the real estate industry.
Yeah, I do think that you have to think about that too, right? It's not just like, oh, we're getting this company to adopt this. It's like consumers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at the FHFA Tech Sprint a couple weeks ago, and the Gen AI use cases that they came up with, this reminds me of some of those, right? And one of the things that the judges brought up over and over again, which shows how hard it is to do what these companies are trying to do, which was, how are you going to create X use case with Gen AI that takes into account both federal and state laws, because so oftentimes those things aren't the same. They conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where a lot of times, your human steps in and goes, okay, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we square the circle. But you still have to have a human in the loop, because it's very difficult. If they're contradictory,
Mm-hmm.
that's not helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's part of the reason why HOMA is still with that forms capability, kind of limiting it to Florida right now. But yeah, I think it's good at, both ReAlpha, which was a company that was actually established over 4 years ago. So, and Modern Realty as well. That there are kind of humans on the back end there and available if you want or need them. And with those both services, there are fees involved. Modern Realty does offer kind of a grant program, and consumers who apply for the grant, if they feel they meet, the criteria that they have, they'll completely waive any and all fees involved for kind of the buy side transaction costs. So, that's a nice service. I think all of these companies, though, at the heart of it, they're looking to help consumers by decreasing costs while still providing those consumers with a resource so they're not completely going blind into this transaction, which is, one of the biggest emotional and financial transactions of their lives. So, obviously, we know based on, some of the most recent NAR statistics that 89% of home buyers still choose to use an agent. Will that change moving forward? I don't know. I know it's been increasing over the past few years. So I think for these companies, especially with the number of them that have kind of blossomed over the past few months, for sure, it's going to take more than just 11% of home buyers to sustain them.
No, I really like when we cover companies that are just coming out with stuff. Really put a stake in the ground there, and then kind of see where they go. Keep them on our radar. Follow them. See what comes of it. Of course, lots of startups don't make it, but then we know of some that have been very successful. So it'll be fun to watch this and see how they evolve. Obviously, at some point, they have to start charging for their services, not giving grants. So that's always a transition. But Brooklee, thanks so much for covering all of this. Listeners, all of these things are available on HousingWire. You can, HousingWire under the real estate tab. You can look up HousingWire Brooklee Han, and all these amazing stories plus many more will come up. But I just appreciate you keeping us abreast of everything that's happening, Brooklee.
Well, thank you so much for having me.